What happens when a CEO goes undercover and finds a janitor crying alone in the break room, only to discover a heartbreaking truth that changes everything? The sun was just beginning to rise when Ethan Carter pulled into the employee parking lot of one of his company's largest office buildings. He sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This wasn't the first time Ethan had gone undercover in his own business, but this time felt different. He wasn't here to test sales tactics or monitor customer service. He was here because something wasn't adding up. Over the past 2 months, productivity had plummeted, complaints about maintenance had surged, and multiple employees had unexpectedly quit. Ethan's executives had brushed it off as temporary struggles, but Ethan trusted his instincts, and something told him there was more to the story. He stepped out of his car, dressed in faded khaki pants and a loose-fitting grey polo. His hair was tousled, his beard slightly unkempt. He looked like just another maintenance worker clocking in for the early shift. A worn-out toolbox dangled from his hand as he walked toward the side entrance. Today, he wasn't Ethan Carter, the powerful CEO. He was Tom Reed, a temporary janitor looking for work. The building's maintenance office was tucked away in the basement, a dimly lit room cluttered with cleaning supplies and worn-out equipment. A man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes greeted Ethan with a weak smile. His name tag read Frank Head Custodian. "You the new guy?" Frank asked, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Tom, just starting today." "All right," Frank muttered, scribbling something down. "You'll be working with Luis today. He'll show you the ropes." Frank's voice was weary, his posture slumped, like a man who had been carrying far too much weight for far too long. Before Ethan could say anything, Frank motioned for him to follow. Luis, a cheerful man in his 30s, greeted Ethan warmly. "Welcome to the glamorous world of janitorial services," he joked, handing Ethan a mop bucket. "Busy day?" Ethan asked as they walked toward the first floor. Luis sighed. Busy doesn't even begin to describe it. He paused, lowering his voice. "We're down 2 people, so we're all picking up extra shifts. Frank's been pulling doubles all week just to keep up. Guy's barely sleeping." "Why are people quitting?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. Luis chuckled bitterly. "Management's been slashing budgets. Less staff, more work, and guess who gets the short end of the stick?" He tapped his name tag. "Folks like us." Ethan's stomach tightened. Throughout the morning, Ethan scrubbed floors, emptied trash bins, and cleaned restrooms alongside Luis. Despite the hard work, Luis kept a positive attitude, but the exhaustion was clear in his face. The few employees who passed by barely acknowledged them, treating them as invisible. By midday, Ethan had seen enough to know something was very wrong. Cleaning supplies were low, equipment was outdated, and employees like Luis were burning themselves out just to keep the place running. But it wasn't until later that afternoon that Ethan witnessed something that truly disturbed him. After finishing his duties in the upstairs conference rooms, Ethan returned to the maintenance office to grab a fresh mop head. As he approached, he heard quiet sobbing coming from inside. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, Ethan saw Frank, the exhausted head custodian, sitting alone at his desk. His shoulders shook, and his face was buried in his hands. "Frank," Ethan said softly, stepping inside. Frank jerked upright, quickly wiping his face. "I'm fine," he muttered gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "You sure?" Ethan pressed gently. "I can tell something's wrong." For a moment, Frank hesitated. Then, as if a dam had burst, he let out a heavy sigh. "I can't do this anymore," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've worked here 22 years, and it's never been like this." "What's going on?" Ethan asked. Frank gestured around the room. "We're drowning," he said. "They cut our budget in half, fired 2 of my best guys, and now they expect us to keep the place spotless with barely any supplies, and no one upstairs even cares." His voice shook. "I stay late every night just to make sure things get done. And last week I found out they're docking my overtime pay because I didn't get approval." Ethan's fists clenched. "That's not right," he muttered. "That's not the worst part," Frank said, his voice lowering. "My wife's sick, Medical bills are piling up. I was counting on that over time. He wiped his eyes again. Now I'm barely hanging on. Ethan's chest tightened. Frank had spent years quietly holding the building together, and yet no one had noticed, or worse, no one seemed to care. I just don't know what to do, Frank whispered. I'm out of options. You're not out of options, Ethan said firmly. Not yet, Frank shook his head, clearly unconvinced. People like me. We don't get second chances. We'll see about that, Ethan muttered. That evening, Ethan returned to his car, heart pounding. He'd come undercover expecting to find inefficiency or laziness, but instead, he found hard-working people being crushed by impossible expectations. And Frank. Frank wasn't just a janitor. He was a man fighting to keep his family afloat, and no one had even noticed. Tomorrow, Ethan wouldn't return as Tom the janitor. Tomorrow, he'd walk in as Ethan Carter, CEO, and he wasn't leaving until things changed. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office building dressed in his usual sharp navy suit. Gone was Tom the janitor. Today, he was Ethan Carter, CEO, and he had no intention of staying quiet. He stepped into the lobby, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors. Employees greeted him with smiles, some exchanging nervous glances. Word of his presence had clearly spread, but Ethan wasn't here to make casual rounds. He was here to confront the people who had allowed this mess to happen. Ethan made his way straight to the top-floor executive wing, where he found Mark Harris, the regional manager, sipping coffee at his desk. Mark looked up in surprise as Ethan entered unannounced. "Mr. Carter," Mark said, rising from his chair. "I wasn't expecting you. If I'd known you were coming, I would have—" "You would have cleaned things up," Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. "And that's exactly why I didn't announce my visit." Mark's smile faltered. "Is something wrong?" "I spent yesterday working as a janitor," Ethan said, "and I found out more in one day than you've apparently noticed in months." Mark's face paled. "Sir, I assure you, our maintenance team is just facing some temporary struggles." "Temporary struggles?" Ethan shot back. "Your team is understaffed, overworked, and using worn-out equipment. Frank, a man who's worked here for over 2 decades, is barely holding this place together. And you're telling me that's temporary? I didn't know it was that bad," Mark stammered. "Then why are they being denied overtime pay?" Ethan demanded. "Why were 2 staff members fired without replacements? And why has Frank been left to clean up everyone else's mess, on his own?" Mark struggled for words. "I was just following budget instructions. We had to cut costs, and the janitorial department seemed like the least important place to trim." "The least important?" Ethan's voice dropped dangerously low. "Frank has been working extra hours to keep this building running, and instead of recognizing his efforts, you punished him by docking his overtime pay." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Look, sir, I didn't think anyone would notice." "Well, I noticed," Ethan said firmly. "And I can promise you, Frank's going to get every penny he's earned." Ethan found Frank in the maintenance office later that afternoon. Frank barely looked up from his clipboard as Ethan walked in. "Hey," Ethan said softly. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Frank muttered. "What's up?" "I know what's been happening," Ethan said. "And I know what they've done to you. The extra hours, the missing pay, all of it." Frank sighed. "Yeah, well, I can't change it." "But I can," Ethan said. Frank finally looked up, confusion etched on his face. "I'm Ethan Carter," Ethan revealed. "I own this company." Frank blinked in disbelief. "Wait, what?" "I came here undercover," Ethan explained. "I needed to see for myself what was happening, and now I know." He paused. "You've been carrying this place on your back, Frank, and I won't let it go unnoticed." Frank shook his head. "I'm not looking for special treatment." "This isn't special treatment," Ethan said. "This is giving you what you deserve." Later that afternoon, Ethan gathered the entire janitorial staff in the employee lounge, faces filled with curiosity and concern as Ethan stood before them. "I know things have been rough," Ethan began. "I know you've been asked to do more with less, and I know some of you have felt invisible because of it." The room stayed quiet. No one dared to speak. "That ends now," Ethan said firmly. "Starting today, we're hiring 3 additional maintenance staff to ease the workload. Equipment upgrades are already on order, and Frank—" He paused, looking directly at the exhausted head custodian. "Will be paid every cent he's owed in overtime." Murmurs spread through the room. Some surprised, some relieved. "I know, this doesn't fix everything," Ethan continued, "but it's a start, and from now on, this company won't treat people like numbers, especially the ones who keep this place running." As the employees dispersed, Frank approached Ethan. His face was still tired, but his eyes were brighter now. "I don't know how to thank you," Frank said. "I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. Together when no one else cared, and that says a lot about the kind of person you are." The following morning, Ethan arrived early, determined to make sure his promises weren't just words. They needed to become action. He found Frank already hard at work, pushing a mop down one of the main hallways. Despite everything, Frank was still showing up before anyone else, doing his best to keep things running. "Morning, Frank," Ethan greeted. "Morning," Frank replied, his voice cautious. "Didn't think I'd still be here today." "You're still here because this place needs you," Ethan said firmly, "and because you deserve better." Frank nodded slowly, still unsure how to believe things would change. Ethan decided to quietly observe the rest of the building. As he walked through the offices, he noticed signs of a bigger problem: employees treating maintenance staff with little respect. A manager dumped coffee in a trash bin that was already overflowing, ignoring Frank's attempts to clean. Another employee left a spilled drink in the breakroom without a second thought, muttering, "That's janitor work." Ethan's frustration grew. The staff didn't just undervalue the janitors, they didn't even see them. This wasn't just about budget cuts. This was a culture issue. Later that morning, Ethan called a meeting with the department heads, the conference room filled with murmurs as managers shuffled in, uncertain about the unexpected meeting. "I'll make this quick," Ethan began, his voice cold. "Yesterday, I uncovered a serious problem, and I'm here to fix it." Several managers exchanged nervous glances. "Our janitorial team has been overworked, disrespected, and ignored for far too long," Ethan continued. "That ends now." He turned to Mark, the regional manager. "You approved budget cuts that crippled the maintenance staff. Frank has been working extra hours without pay, while you told him his overtime didn't count." "I didn't know," Mark began, but Ethan cut him off. "You didn't care," Ethan snapped. "But you're going to now." His gaze hardened. "Because if I see one more employee treating this staff like they're invisible, they won't just be losing their jobs, they'll be explaining it in court." The room went silent. "The maintenance team will get the resources they need," Ethan continued. "And if anyone here has a problem with that, you can leave today." No one moved. "Good," Ethan said firmly, "because I'm not asking." That afternoon, Ethan called Frank to his office. Frank walked in cautiously, unsure what to expect. "Sit down," Ethan said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've done here, and it's clear this place only survived because of you. I was just doing my job," Frank muttered. "No," Ethan corrected. "You were doing far more than that, and it's time you're recognized for it." Ethan pulled a small box from his desk and slid it across the table. "This," Ethan said, "is a token of my gratitude." Frank opened the box and stared. Inside was a set of keys. "What's this?" Frank asked, his brow furrowed. "Your promotion," Ethan explained. "Starting today, you're no longer just the head janitor. You're the building operations supervisor. Full salary increase, new benefits, and a management role. I don't know what to say," Frank stammered. "I've never—" His voice broke. "No one's ever given me a chance like this." You earned this, Ethan said, and it's about time you knew that. Frank wiped his eyes and extended his hand. Ethan shook it firmly. That evening, Ethan stayed late, walking the halls one final time. He found Lena, the kind receptionist, who had often quietly tried to help Frank, wiping down a counter in the break room. I didn't know you were still here, Ethan said. Just helping out, Lena shrugged. Frank's been doing too much on his own for too long. That's exactly what I needed to see, Ethan replied with a smile. People stepping up, not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Lena smiled back. Guess we're all learning from Frank. Yeah, Ethan said thoughtfully. We are. In the days following Ethan's intervention, the atmosphere inside the office building began to shift. Employees had been reminded that respect wasn't optional. It was essential. But while Ethan was proud of the progress, he knew that true. Change required more than just speeches and promises. He needed to ensure this new culture lasted. Ethan called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss long-term changes. I want this building to become a model for every branch we run, Ethan began. That means new policies, better resources, and real consequences for those who disrespect their colleagues. I agree, said Linda, the HR manager. But what exactly does that look like? It starts by changing the way we see our maintenance staff, Ethan replied. They're not just the cleanup crew. They're part of the backbone that keeps this company running. From now on, janitors, custodians, and maintenance workers will have their own dedicated support structure. He outlined his plan. Pay increases for janitorial staff, with clear paths for promotions. Mandatory respect training for all employees, emphasizing the value of all roles. Emergency hardship funds available to employees in financial distress. Anonymous reporting systems to ensure employees felt safe speaking up about mistreatment. This isn't just about fixing one office, Ethan added. It's about setting a standard, one that shows everyone's work matters. Frank's promotion to building operations supervisor quickly became a turning point. Now equipped with authority, Frank wasted no time setting things right. His first move was to hire 2 new janitors, Miguel and Denise, both of whom had experience but had struggled to find work due to company budget cuts. We're glad you're here, Frank told them. I know what it's like to feel invisible, but not anymore. If you've got concerns, you come straight to me. We're a team now. Within days, the building looked better than it had in months. Floors shined, break rooms were spotless, and employees began to notice. Frank, Lena said one morning, this place, it just feels different. Frank chuckled. Yeah, and about time too. One afternoon while walking the floors, Ethan noticed a familiar face near the elevator. Marcus, the former manager who had ignored Frank's struggles and disrespected the janitors. What are you doing here? Ethan asked, his voice firm. I came to apologize, Marcus said. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I was wrong. He paused. I know I don't deserve a second chance. But if there's anything I can do to make things right, I want to try. Ethan studied Marcus for a moment. You want to make things right? Yes, Marcus said quietly. Then start by listening, Ethan replied. Spend a week shadowing Frank and his team, and I mean really listening. If you still want a second chance after that, we'll talk. Marcus nodded, accepting the offer without hesitation. The following week, Ethan watched closely as Marcus worked alongside Frank and his crew. At first, Marcus struggled, scrubbing floors, hauling trash, and enduring the thankless tasks he once dismissed. But slowly, his attitude shifted. One afternoon, Ethan overheard Marcus quietly apologizing to Frank. I didn't realize how hard this job was, Marcus admitted. I should have stood up for you, not made things worse. Took you long enough, Frank replied with a small grin. But I'll take it. The 2 men shook hands, and for the first time, Ethan believed Marcus might truly change. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's changes had a ripple effect. Employees began showing more respect to the janitorial staff, not out of fear, but out of genuine appreciation. Frank's team felt seen, valued, and motivated. One afternoon, Ethan walked into the break room and found several office employees chatting with Denise and Miguel over coffee. It wasn't just small talk. They were laughing together like old friends. "Looks like things are finally turning around," Lena said as she joined Ethan. "Yeah," Ethan replied. "And it's because people like Frank never gave up." "He's one of the strongest people I've ever met," Lena said. "You know, a lot of folks would have walked away after what Frank went through." "That's exactly why he's the kind of leader this place needs," Ethan said proudly. On Frank's first payday, as building operations supervisor, Ethan visited him in his office. "Got a minute?" Ethan asked, carrying a small envelope. "Sure," Frank said, still adjusting to the sight of his own nameplate on the door. Ethan handed Frank the envelope. "This is from the company's hardship fund," Ethan explained. "I know you're come. Wife's been sick. And I know you've had a rough few months. Consider this a thank you and a fresh start." Frank opened the envelope and stared in disbelief. Inside was a check large enough to cover his wife's medical bills. Frank's voice wavered. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Ethan said. "Just take care of your family." For the first time in a long time, Frank's shoulders seemed lighter. "I will," he whispered. "Thank you." Several weeks later, Ethan stood in the main hallway, quietly watching Frank chat with Lena and Miguel. The three of them laughed together, joking like old friends. For the first time in a long while, the building felt warm, like a place where people wanted to be. "That's what it's all about," Ethan thought to himself. He turned and walked away, confident that this place and the people in it were finally on the right path. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that prove kindness and courage can change everything.